Long before the British set foot on African soil, Africa was already alive with kingdoms, cultures, and civilizations. Great empires like Mali, Songhai, and Benin were centers of trade and learning. In Mali, the city of Timbuktu was famous for its libraries and universities. In the east, Ethiopia had ancient Christian traditions stretching back over 1,000 years. The great Zimbabwe Empire built stone cities that still stand today. Across the continent, people farmed, traded gold and salt, raised cattle, and developed rich cultures and traditions. Africa was not an empty land waiting to be discovered. It was a continent of power and history. But while Africa thrived, Europe was changing. The 15th century brought what historians call the Age of Exploration. New ships were built that could sail farther and faster. Countries like Portugal, Spain, and later Britain and France began sending explorers across the seas. Their goal was simple: to find wealth, new lands, and new trade routes. In 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed west and landed in what he thought was Asia but was actually the Americas. To the Europeans, this was the New World, meaning the newly discovered continents of North and South America and the islands of the Caribbean. The New World was vast, fertile, and rich in resources. The Europeans planted sugar, cotton, tobacco, and other crops on massive farms called plantations. But they faced a problem: they needed labor to work these fields. At first, they tried to use the native people of the Americas, but diseases like smallpox wiped out millions. Desperate for workers, they turned to Africa. This was the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. Starting in the 1500s, European traders began capturing and buying Africans, forcing them onto ships bound for the New World. This system became known as the triangular trade. Ships left Europe loaded with guns, cloth, and alcohol. They sailed to Africa, where these goods were exchanged for human beings. The captives were forced onto slave ships, chained together in dark, airless holds. The journey across the Atlantic, called the Middle Passage, was pure horror. Many died of hunger, disease, or abuse. Those who survived were sold like animals in the markets of Brazil, the Caribbean, and North America. From there, the products of their labor, sugar, cotton, and tobacco, were shipped back to Europe, completing the triangle. Britain became the largest slave-trading nation in the world. By the 1700s, British ships were transporting hundreds of thousands of Africans each year. The profits were immense. The city of Liverpool grew rich, and families in London built fortunes. Behind their wealth lay African suffering. Whole villages in Africa were emptied. Wars were fought between kingdoms fueled by the desire to capture slaves for sale. Generations were lost, cultures weakened, and Africa's strength drained. By the early 1800s, the transatlantic slave trade was abolished. Britain ended it officially in 1807 and later used its navy to fight illegal slavers. But even though the trade ended, Africa's ordeal was not over. Europe now entered a new phase of exploitation. The 19th century was the age of industry in Europe. Britain led the way. Its factories needed cotton, rubber, palm oil, copper, and other raw materials. Its merchants wanted new markets to sell finished goods. To them, Africa was a continent waiting to be taken. Explorers such as Mungo Park and David Livingstone went deep into Africa's interior, mapping rivers and describing lands Europeans had never seen. Missionaries followed, preaching Christianity and building schools. Traders arrived seeking business opportunities. But behind all of this lay a larger plan: to control Africa. By the late 1800s, European powers were racing to grab as much territory as they could. France expanded in West Africa, Belgium took the Congo, Germany entered East Africa, and Britain pushed from the north and south. Tension was rising. To avoid fighting each other, the Europeans met in 1884 at the Berlin Conference. No African was invited. Around a table, European leaders took maps and drew lines across Africa. Kingdoms, tribes, and cultures were ignored. Territories were handed out as if they were prizes. Britain took Nigeria, Ghana, Sierra Leone, Kenya, Uganda, South Africa, and more. France claimed huge portions of West Africa. Belgium claimed the Congo. Germany, Portugal, and Italy all got pieces. In less than 20 years, almost the entire continent of Africa had been carved up by foreigners. But Africans did not simply submit. In South Africa, the Zulus under King Shaka and later King Cetshwayo resisted British encroachment. They fought bravely in battles like Isandlwana. In West Africa, the Ashanti fought for wars against the British. In what is now Zimbabwe, the Ndebele and Shona resisted. In East Africa, the Maji-Maji rebellion erupted against German rule, and although it was crushed, it showed that Africans would not bow quietly. Ethiopia under Emperor Menelik II defeated Italy at the Battle of Adwa in 1896, becoming one of the few African nations to remain free. Despite this resistance, Britain and the other colonial powers had superior weapons, rifles, machine guns, and cannons. African armies, armed mostly with spears and muskets, could not match them. One by one, kingdoms fell. By the start of the 1900s, Britain controlled vast stretches of Africa. Once in power, Britain established its system of rule. In some colonies like Kenya, it ruled directly, sending British officials. In others, like Nigeria, it used indirect rule, governing through local chiefs. Taxes were imposed, forcing Africans to work on plantations or in mines to earn money. Land was taken away from communities and given to settlers. Resources such as cocoa from Ghana, rubber from Nigeria, tea from Kenya, and gold from South Africa were extracted and sent to Britain. Railways were built, but their purpose was not to connect African people. They were built to move resources from the interior to the coast, straight onto ships bound for Europe. Life under British rule was harsh. Traditional leaders lost authority. Cultures and religions were suppressed. English became the language of power. Schools taught British history and values while African heritage was pushed aside. Many Africans were treated as second class in their own land. But resistance never disappeared. Africans kept protesting, rebelling, and organizing. In South Africa, the discovery of gold and diamonds led to wars and eventually to a system that favored whites and oppressed the majority black population. In Kenya, the Mau Mau uprising fought against settler rule. In West Africa, educated Africans began demanding a voice. They formed newspapers, unions, and political groups. The two world wars of the 20th century changed everything. Thousands of Africans fought for Britain in Europe and Asia. When they returned home, they asked a simple question: why should they fight for freedom abroad while living under colonial rule at home? The demand for independence grew louder. Leaders emerged: Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya, Nnamdi Azikiwe in Nigeria, and many more. They organized protests, strikes, and negotiations. Britain, weakened by the wars and facing pressure, realized it could no longer hold on to Africa. In 1957, Ghana became the first sub-Saharan African country to win independence. Nigeria followed in 1960. Kenya gained freedom after years of struggle. Across the continent, one by one, nations broke free from colonial rule. By the 1970s, nearly all of Africa had reclaimed its independence. But the legacy of British rule remained. The borders drawn at the Berlin Conference had forced together people of different tribes and religions, creating tensions that still exist today. Economies had been built not for Africans but for the benefit of Europe, leaving many countries dependent on exports. Political systems copied from Britain did not always fit African societies. The story of how Africa was enslaved by Britain is long and painful. It began with ships and traders, grew into centuries of slavery, and later transformed into colonial domination. It is a story of kingdoms broken, cultures reshaped, and resources drained. But it is also a story of resistance, survival, and eventual freedom.